Hi, everyone. I am De'Ara, the host of the All Kinds of Minds podcast. I represent Social Cipher, an edtech company that makes social and emotional learning games for neurodivergent students. The All Kinds of Minds podcast is all about sharing tips, strategies, and insights to support the K 12 professionals who support neurodivergent youth. Today, we have Amy Bodkins as our guest. She's a former school psychologist, parent of two autistic kids, homeschool consultant, and she's autistic herself. So, we're going to be talking about different ways schools and districts can improve and become more inclusive. I am so excited about this conversation because she's coming from the perspective of someone who worked in schools and someone who now works with the parents who took their children out of school. So, let's just go ahead and jump right in. Hi,
Yeah,
Amy.
it's great to be here. I really appreciate getting to have this conversation with you.
Thank you so much for being here. So, can you tell our listeners more about your background and what you're doing now?
Yeah, so I was trained as a school psychologist back when I was in graduate school. I worked in public schools. Some of the schools I worked in had the second highest dropout rate in the nation, and also had 75% free lunch and no AP classes for the entire district. So I was definitely working in some areas where we need a lot of support. After working in public schools, I became pregnant, and apparently my body's allergic to being pregnant. So I started consulting with private schools at that point. And then from there, I ended up starting to consult with homeschoolers worldwide because we had started homeschooling ourselves. And I had parents going, wait, can you do what you do for your kids for mine? And so that's how it started. I now work with not just homeschoolers. A lot of my base is homeschoolers because homeschoolers love to step out of any system that they can. We like to think outside the box. So I do get a lot of homeschoolers still. So
That's pretty cool how you just kind of fell into it.
it really is. And
Yeah.
it's really been kind of neat to be able to see the differences between public education, private education, and homeschooling. I like to tell people that education is like having a baby. It doesn't really matter how you have the baby, so long as we have the baby at the end of the day. Like that's the
Hmm.
goal. And a lot of times the choices that we make are honestly based around what intimidates us most. You know, is it the epidural or the natural childbirth that intimidates you more? Is it advocating for an IEP or just educating your child yourself that scares you more? Some people are amazing advocates, and then other people are like, no, let me just do it myself. So
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What are some of those differences you notice between public, private, and homeschool as far as the support neurodivergent students get?
there are options all three ways. Um, but you go about those options in different ways. So, for instance, in public schools, most people are pretty familiar. We have IEPs and we also have 504s, and that ensures that a child is receiving the services granted by the public school system through FAPE. So, free and appropriate education. However, one thing I think it's important to point out is that a free and appropriate education is not determined by what the parent thinks is appropriate or anybody else thinks is appropriate. It's determined by the school district and what they think is appropriate, which, as much as we don't want to have a bias, we all have a bias. And so when we are in charge of determining what's appropriate, but we're also the ones in charge of, the budgeting or the allocation of resources, we do have a bias. And so just because it's an appropriate education does not mean it's a good education necessarily. It could be a great education, but that's not guaranteed. You're not guaranteed a good education or a great education. You're guaranteed an appropriate education. Private schools, you can have an IEP and a 504 in a private school. Generally speaking, though, all of those services would be provided by the private school, and they are not bound to provide as many services as public schools are bound to provide. Although, if you have a parent who's paying for private education, a lot of times they also will choose to pay for private therapy as well. So those are all possibilities. There's definitely less red tape, so there's a little bit more creativity, but there's also less teeth guaranteeing those rights. So it is dependent on the relationship between the family and the school as to how that might go. When we're looking at homeschooling, technically, homeschoolers and private schoolers are supposed to be covered through IDEA. However, many states have tried to say that homeschoolers are not private schoolers, and so therefore they don't have to cover them. It's a loophole that they've found. And so because of that, it depends on what state you're in as to what kinds of services are available to you. The plus side about homeschooling is that you have the ultimate freedom to do whatever the heck you want, pretty much. I mean, you're definitely under, guidance from your state. Some states have more and some states have less to, check your boxes, make sure, we're following through on the things we're supposed to follow through on. But other than that, you have a wide range of freedom to tailor an education to a specific child's needs. So there's pluses and minuses no matter which way you go. It just depends on knowing the system you're in and how to use that system.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because I didn't realize that what's considered an appropriate education comes from the district. So that leaves room to inequity throughout the state, throughout the country, based on, what each specific district prioritizes. So that's really interesting.
Well, and you can take that to court and you can argue. And like people do go through due process to try and get more appropriate services when they feel that the district isn't doing their due diligence. And sometimes they win, but it is costly, both time and energy-wise, to parents who don't always necessarily have that extra time and energy.
Right.
So, but there are safeguards in place to protect the families. So.
You said there are what?
Safeguards in place. That's why when you have an IEP meeting, you get your procedural safeguards every time. Because they're there to let you know that there are advocacy groups you can call and ways to get those services guaranteed. But yes, it is greatly dependent upon the ethics of the administration in your district. I've seen some districts where the administration has extremely questionable ethics and has done stuff that's illegal that harmed children. So it is dependent. And honestly, that's the case with no matter what you choose. No matter what you choose, it depends on the ethics of the people that you're talking with. Are they people of really good character who make really good decisions with the child's needs in mind? Or do they have an ulterior motive of some kind? Those are things we have to think about.
Yeah, that's a lot. And that can be scary, especially as a parent, when you're dealing with your child's education. That's a lot. So as a homeschool consultant who has worked in schools, what do you see as the biggest or some of the biggest shortcomings in schools that lead families to choose homeschooling?
Well, I think FAPE is definitely one of those big ones. Free and appropriate education. I think a lot of times when parents choose to pull out of the public school system when they have a neurodivergent child, it's because they think we can do better. And I think that often is what drives parents. This can be better. It's not to say that what's provided is bad. It's just they're saying, hey, I think we can do this better in some way. And, maybe it's not the parent who thinks that they can do it better, but they're like, hey, I've got resources. I can make things happen, coordinate. The other thing is that the school hours, the sensory stimulation, the social environment, all of the rules, all of that can be extremely overloading, especially in middle school. I very often tell people, I'm like, if you're ever going to homeschool, do it in middle school. We, for some reason, thought it was a good idea to put all these kids whose hormones are changing in a building all together and think, hey, what could go wrong? I wonder. So I used to work in middle schools and junior highs a lot. That was the group that I always ended up with, and I loved it because it was something new every day. They were coming up with new ways of breaking rules and trying to get away with stuff.
Absolutely. I taught middle school as well, middle and high school. So yeah, I know.
Yeah, middle school is not the same as high school, is it?
No.
Yeah. By
Not
that
at
point,
all.
they have some of that maturity that they're lacking before, so that makes a difference. But I think that when you have a neurodivergent kid who's got sensory overload and those kinds of things going on, which get worse during puberty because you're already getting a sensory load from all those hormones changing. So you kind of end up not having as many spoons as you used to have. It goes away after your hormones change because then you suddenly have more spins because, hey, I'm not dealing with hormones changing now. But it's a lot. And so because of that, whenever I tell parents, I'm like, look, if you're ever going to homeschool, do it in junior high, middle school when those hormones are changing because we have fewer spins available. Sometimes we need more sleep. We need less demands, those kinds of things. Now, you can accommodate for those in a school environment as well. So that's a possibility.
Mhm.
It's a possibility. There's definitely parents that I have run into who have been able to, especially in the days post-COVID, have been able to take their children online completely or to do a part of a day in the school, part of the day online. And online has a lot of benefits because when we're online, we control the sound, the brightness, what we're doing. Like we control the whole environment. And so it makes it a little bit easier than being in person somewhere. There's also usually fewer social expectations online. So,
Yeah, so it sounds like it comes down a lot to being able to give their child that individualized support that they need, that as well-meaning as a school might be, they aren't
sure.
able to give because they have so many students and
There's
only limited
limits.
staff. Yeah.
There's limits when you have a system that you're working within.
Mhm.
The system that you're working within with a private school is different from the system you're working in with a public school. But no matter what, when you have a system, there are limitations. And the larger the system is, sometimes the more limitations we have to work with because it's not so simple to go up the chain and change something. Whereas
Right.
in a small private school, okay, well, let's talk to the headmaster. Let's get some changes made.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, what would you say are 2 lessons schools can learn from the homeschooling environment to better support neurodivergent students in schools?
Okay, this is totally not practical yet, but I think it is one of the best things that we could do. And it's going to sound absolutely nuts, but hang with me.
Okay.
I think what we can learn from homeschooling is the idea of the one room classroom. Because in a homeschool setting, you're learning with people of a wide range of ages and grade levels. And the way we have things divided up in a school is by age and grade. But when we divide things up by age and grade, we're kind of presenting this false idea that all children develop at about the same rate, at about the same age. And if you don't, well, then you're obviously the unusual one. But in reality, that's not how it works. And so, used to be when we had one room classrooms, and actually, we still have some of those one room classrooms today. There was a private school I worked with through the Seventh day Adventist congregations that had a complete, like, one room classroom. All grade levels from kindergarten through eighth grade were together. And it actually worked pretty well. A lot of the kids, it became more like a family. And so you kind of learn to support each other at different levels, but you were also still getting that individualized instruction at the level that you needed. But there's also a bit of independence expected. And that can be a really good thing. When kids are given independence, then a lot of times they will rise to the occasion, assuming it's fitted towards what their abilities and needs are. So I think that idea of creating an environment where we can be encouraging kids to be somewhat more independent, to take charge of their own learning. We want kids to want to learn and to not have to be dragged through an education. We want them to be inspired to take ownership of it, but also being in an environment where we are also learning socially that all people are different and there's not one right way to be. I think those are some really helpful things that could be learned from what we're able to do in a homeschool setting. How practical that is, Well, we have been away from the one-room schoolhouse for a long time, so that would be a really, really big shift for us.
Yeah.
So, might not be terribly practical in our current situation. However, um, I do think that we learn a lot from spending time with people who are different from us. And the more we can do that in a school setting, I think the better off we are because you're learning a lot of soft skills that way. You're learning that other people are different and that they're valuable as they are. When people interact with somebody who is racially, religiously, or um, neurologically different from them, having that friend makes a huge difference with how they choose to move forward with thinking about those kinds of people who fall in that category and how they choose to accept others with differences as they grow up. That's a really important lesson. The whole point of education is not to be able to get a job. We got that idea in the Industrial Revolution. We thought, okay, guys, we've learned a lot from these assembly lines. Let's apply the same thing to education. So we're going to put kids on this assembly line. We're going to give them the things they need, and then we're going to give them a job, or they're going to find a job, and they're going to move on. The point of education is to learn to be a better human. And that's what the humanities teach. It's also some of the subjects that are first to go when funding is cut. The arts, music, literature usually isn't cut. However, a lot of times we will downsize literature.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Humanities, that's really important. We should all be teaching the humanities. We need to be more better humans.
Yeah. Very true. Very, very true.
And that's very accessible no matter where you are because there are
Right.
always ways to add in the humanities.
Right. So you would say like that's a big thing, like so the one room schoolhouse, but then the other thing would be like more emphasis on the humanities.
Yes, yes. And with a one-room schoolhouse, if you can't do a one-room schoolhouse, maybe we can let kids have more interaction with kids of a wide range of ages. So,
Mhm.
a lot of times we focus inclusion on bringing all of our special needs department along with the typical kids. So we bring them into their classrooms. What if we did it backwards? What if we brought our typical learners into our special needs classrooms? We don't
What do
usually
you
think about doing that.
what do you think would happen doing it that way?
I think in order to do that, we would have to recognize that there are things of value that you can learn from people who are neurodivergent. And I think the problem is that we often don't recognize that people who are neurodivergent have value. Because otherwise, why would we be trying to bring them along to be like everybody else? That's not seeing value in someone who's neurodivergent. What we need to be doing is recognizing that value and saying, you know what? Spending time playing with another child, doing things that they find comfortable. Maybe that's art. Okay, you know what? We're going to bring art into our special needs classrooms. And we are going to create projects that they can do that are at a wide range of abilities where people have a lot of free choice so that everyone can work where they need to work and that everyone can shine in whatever way they're able to shine. Some kids are going to love sitting there and coloring and drawing and will be very creative. And sometimes some neurodivergent kids are really good at art because it can be a way that they communicate with the world around them. Other neurodivergent kids can often be very gifted in music. Most of the time when we have someone who's neurodivergent, it represents an imbalance in the development of their brain. And when we see that imbalance, there's always strengths because you do not get a weakness without having a strength, and you do not get a strength without having a weakness. It is your weaknesses that give you your strengths. And so if we remove humanities, the arts, music, some of those areas that some of us have greater strengths in, that not only prevents us from accessing things that are enjoyable and that we're good at, but it can also mean that we end up bringing our special education kids along to our regular education classes for inclusion. So why not go the other way around? So we bring, a lot of times when you're doing inclusion, you'll say, okay, well, we can fit them into PE and we can fit them into, science or
Mhm.
art, or, they're going to get their socialization through lunch and things like that. Well, why don't we do it the other way around? We bring kids into a PE class that's pretty much all special needs kids, and we've got um, adaptive PE. Adaptive PE is meant to be used by everybody. So, that's my thought.
Yeah, no, that makes sense because even aside from, like, learning from each other, that would also just help with understanding each other
Mhm.
better.
We're building
And
relationships.
yeah, and even, like, having empathy for each other, for each other's strengths and weaknesses and things like that. So, I could see huge value in that because like you said, it's about becoming a better person, and so gaining that understanding of how other people think, how other people function, like, that helps us all to communicate better and just
Oh,
live together better.
right, and it also means that we are sharing with other kids who are different from us what they love, so they're sharing with us what they love. Whereas if you think about inclusion and how it works, it's always bringing kids who have some kind of an IEP or something along with the typical classroom setting. But when you really want to get to know someone and show that they have value, you have to sit down and be willing to get in their space and listen to what they love. That's how we build a relationship. It's not by saying, "Oh, well, let me bring you along with me." No, it starts by getting to know the person. Then if you wanna bring them along with you, that's fine. But you
Right,
need to
right.
get to know the person first, see what they love, what's valuable about them so that you can appreciate them as an individual.
Yeah, instead of just marking off the checklist, like, "Okay, they came to this class, that's inclusion."
That was actually, I think, one of the biggest mistakes, we've made with regards to IEPs. We created That's the thing. We will always try to create products that can be useful, and sometimes those products are aimed at trying to make our life easier, but when we do that, we remove the human component. So with IEPs, we have created entire, like, computer programs where you choose from a drop-down menu of, "These are the accommodations we're providing." Um, we've also focused on SMART goals, which always irritate me. I get to have the opportunity to see IEPs from all over the country
Mhm.
because I have kids from all over the place. What is interesting about these SMART goals is that it is obviously a legal document that is being used to protect the district because, yes, they are specific, measurable, and all of those wonderful things. But when the goal says something like Johnny will learn to sit down for 5 minutes at a time and pay attention, what is the district doing to ensure that Johnny can do that? That's never listed most of the time.
Yeah.
The IEP should be our promise to children, not a legal document protecting ourselves.
Why do you think it's like that?
I think it's because people are afraid of being sued, to be
Yeah.
perfectly honest, and I get that. And, it is important to protect ourselves, but we cannot protect ourselves at the expense of children. So if we're going to protect ourselves with that legal document, it should also be protecting the children. What are we providing to you? What's our guarantee to you to make sure that you have the skills necessary to be able to accomplish what we think might be good for you? And also to go back and reevaluate whether or not that actually is good for you, because
Mhm.
sometimes what we think is good or what we think is appropriate for where they're at is not. We've also gotten further away from more traditional assessment. We're still using them, but we've moved more into curriculum-based assessments. Curriculum-based assessments aren't bad, but neither are traditional assessments either. They tell us two different things, and it is only when we recognize that all of that data gives us a snapshot in time of a child and where they're at, that it really helps us to understand okay, this is who this kid is, and this is where they're at. And this information tells us that this is the next thing that they seem to be ready to do or ready to work on, or this is, kind of where we're at. And you have to take all that information together. Otherwise, we're just guessing. And guessing, I don't know about your guesses, but my guesses usually aren't that great without data to back it up.
Right.
So,
Yeah. So you were talking about how in doing inclusion like the right way, where it's not just putting neurodivergent kids in classrooms with neurotypical students. You were talking about how that involves being able to see the strengths and that there is something to learn from neurodivergent students. And I found from being a teacher that a lot of the bias comes from the teachers and this, I would say, old school mentality about autism and ADHD and other types of neurodivergence where it's like this needs to be fixed. This needs to be toned down. And we're going to tone this down by putting them around students who are neurotypical. It's like, a lot of I think we're starting to move away from that in education,
mhm.
but I became a teacher in 2017, and that was still very much so the kind of ingrained in the training. I didn't receive that much training actually on how to work with neurodivergent students,
No.
which would probably be surprising for people outside of education, but the training that I did receive, it definitely did have that undertone of, we need to do what we have to do, include them so that we can help them be better. And it's so
Mhm.
sad. It's so
Yeah.
sad. Especially like being here, I learned more about neurodiversity, affirming strategies and all this. And I'm just like, this is not what we're actually this what teachers are learning.
Right.
And it
And
might depend on the state. I'm in Georgia. So
well, each state is a little bit different, but I guarantee you that is a nationwide issue.
yeah.
Um, and I do know from when I was in graduate school that they were doing studies at that time on teacher education program, and there were very few teacher training programs that included any kind of training in behavior management, like classroom management,
Mhm.
which you would think that might be something that would be important to teach since,
Yeah.
you know, you're going to be putting them in a classroom with 20, 30 different kids.
Right.
And when it becomes one adult versus 20 to 30, yeah, that's definitely something you need help with. So they're supposed to just kind of figure out how to do it based on their own experiences
Mhm.
growing up in schools and in a family. That's a recipe for disaster right there because you don't know what kind of experiences they had and if their experiences were positive or not.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
Mhm. Yeah, so
It's
there's definitely a gap between what we are sharing with our teachers, and we should be sharing much more with them, because there are some really wonderful teachers out there.
Mhm.
But we also, I think, stress teachers out by giving them we don't give them enough training, and then we give them too much work.
Yeah. And then there's no time to get the training to help you improve and yeah,
Exactly.
it's a lot of misalignment there that
Mhm.
makes it really difficult to support the students as best as possible. So what would you say, how can you say educators let me see how to word it. How can educators recognize and address their own biases and misconceptions about neurodivergent students?
A lot of it is being willing. And I've worked with a lot of different teachers over the years. Some of them were absolutely phenomenal. I'll tell you a story about one student I had. He was in 7th grade, and I was the school psychologist at that school. And so he was having a lot of behavioral problems. So I pulled him, did a student interview. One of the questions I asked him was, if I could do anything to get you to behave, what could I do? Now, I was fully expecting him to say, I want to play video games at school because, I mean, that sounds like a really good answer.
Yeah.
He said, I want to learn to read. He had gotten to 7th grade and could not read. And his special education teacher refused to work with him. I had to go find another special education teacher who did not have him on her roster, who volunteered to pull him every day for the next 2 years. And by the time he left that school, he was reading at a 3rd grade reading level.
Why did that teacher refuse?
She had a very bad relationship with that student because he was causing a lot of problems in her classroom, but it was because he couldn't read.
Yeah.
And also, let's be honest, there are always people in every profession who you could call them your bad apples. It's not necessarily that they're bad. It's
Mhm.
just they don't put in the same amount of effort or care that others do.
And it's just a
And
job.
yeah,
Yeah.
and sometimes once you get tenure, it's kinda like, "Oh, I'm just here to collect my check. Let
Mhm.
me just, keep going, keep this easy, simple, don't rock the boat, don't, take on anything extra."
Yeah. We
Yeah,
did
it's
a,
hard, but it's true.
we did an episode with, Renee Sanchez. He's a superintendent in California, and he mentioned the soft bigotry of low expectations, and that's exactly what that reminds me of, like, just placing these low expectations, and that's a bias,
It is.
and so not actually challenging students and helping them reach their full potential.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And, I mean, it's really, like, a lot bigger than even just the teachers because, yes, you have teachers who, do have that bias, who, they've gotten tenure, they're tired, they're worn
Mhm.
out, and, I mean, we understand why they're tired and worn out. I mean, with the amount of work that we give to teachers that's off the clock, that they're technically not paid for but required to do,
Mhm.
it's a lot. But it's really bigger than that. Um when we are looking at entire districts, some of our districts just don't have the same resources. We're also dealing with things that are coming in from the neighborhood. So, there was one district I worked with where they had a culture of the entire neighborhood not having high expectations of their children. And so the expectation was that you would go to school until you got out, and then you'd have a baby, you'd get, a check for having the child, and then the children that I worked with actually told me, they're like, "Well, yeah, then you beat the kid until they're stupid so you can get a crazy check."
What?
Yes. The children actually told me that. And, another aspect of that because if you have a disability of some kind and you are receiving, welfare check, then you can get extra money for a child with special needs. And we had a lot of special needs kids in that district who grew up to be adults that ended up having a lot of children with a lot of different women, and then their children were in our system. I had I had a, school district I was working at. The, principal okayed giving rotten food from the kitchen to the kids in in-school suspension, and I had to call child nutrition for the entire district to get them to come in and do something about it because, the teachers that were aware of it were afraid of losing their jobs, and I wasn't paid by the district at that time, so it was very easy for me to say, "Hey, y'all need to come in and take a look at this." Um
Oh my goodness.
Oh, yeah. That's part of the reason I'm not in public schools anymore because I got burned out.
Yeah.
And it's easy for our teachers to get burned out because they deal with a lot of stuff, and there's some tough stuff. I had a teacher that, she was targeted by one of her students, and, like, he came back into the classroom and dropped his pants and was basically, like, kind of assaulting her.
Oh my
Um
goodness.
I mean, these kinds of things happen in our schools, and that's why humanities are so important. We've
Mm.
gotta learn to be better people. We gotta
Yeah.
learn to be good humans, and sometimes if we focus so much on behavior and inclusion and things like that,
Mhm.
inclusion where we're bringing people along, which is basically nothing more than focusing on behavior. But when
Mhm.
we focus solely on behavior, we're not really creating an environment where we can learn to be a better human.
Yeah.
Teaching kids how to work within a system, which working within a system can be a real negative because
Mhm.
that system can end up locked down tighter and tighter. And then at what point does it become a prison?
I think in some places it's already past that point.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
especially in our alternative schools. We actually had an alternative school in Florida back in, I think, 2008, where they found dead bodies of students from that alternative school
What?
dug up. Yes, yes, these things happen. Mhm.
It had never been reported that they were.
There had been suspicions, but it wasn't until they were, I think, digging up some stuff on the grounds or something
Oh my goodness.
that bodies were found. And, so yeah, the problem is that when we're talking about neurodivergence or really any kind of difference, but especially neurodivergence, children who are neurodivergent are more likely to be targeted by people.
Mhm.
And I think, and it's not just neurodivergent. Like I use a mix of neurodivergent and special needs in my work because I've
Yeah.
got kids who've had cancer, I've got kids who've been adopted, have some kind of trauma in their life, and they're not really quite good with taking on the moniker of neurodivergent, despite the fact that they probably are.
Yeah.
Um, but no matter what the disability is or the neurodivergence or, whatever it is that makes us different, um, a lot of times people can take advantage of that. I mean, if you look back to World War II, the first death camps were created for people with disabilities, the
Wow.
very first ones. And a lot of that is because sometimes we don't have the ability to fight back. You have to have somebody who has, one, the verbal communication skills to be able to say that. And then beyond that, you have to, be able to create understanding in other people. You have to be able to
Yeah.
connect with other people to say, "Hey, this isn't right." And then they have to have the ethics to stand up and say, "Oh, you're right. That's not right." Um, that's a really big problem, I think. And we are very often more targeted because for a lot of us, it can be harder to advocate for ourselves,
Mhm.
especially when we're children, especially when we're children.
And that's why it's so important for the adults to listen
Exactly.
and to pay attention. So, you mentioned something before about people being afraid of losing their jobs and things
Yeah.
like that. So, what advice would you give to school administrators and district administrators of things they can do to make sure that their staff feels, safe
Yeah.
in advocating for their students' well-being? Because I know no district administrator, even if they don't care about the kids, which unfortunately is the case sometimes, they don't wanna be on the news for something
Mhm.
bad happening to the kids.
Oh, yeah.
So, empowering the teachers and related service professionals to advocate for the students benefits them as well.
It does, it does. Um, I think the most important thing is creating a culture of a high standard of ethics, higher than what is required. Because when we create red tape to protect children, um, administrators are just as good as kids at finding ways around the rules. I mean, that's what we do as human beings.
Okay.
You give us a problem, we find a way around it. It's not necessarily that, we're trying to, you know, be bad or cause a problem or whatever. It's just that human beings, we see problems, we find a way around the problem. So in order to protect your district from becoming involved in things like that, you really have to set the standard with a very high standard of ethics. It's not, what is right in this business? What is right for these children? And you really need to think outside the box and also listen to other people, especially children and those children who have grown up to be adults and what they can share with you. Your teachers, especially the ones who are really dedicated to their students, those are ones that are worth listening to. Also, being involved in your district, finding out what's going on, making sure that you don't just live at the office, leaving that office, going to the different schools, maybe trying to get somebody else to go who's not a known administrator so that you can kind of see, okay, what's this really like, Um, I think those kinds of things could be very valuable. Uh, yeah, there are so many times that when we don't hold ourselves to high ethical standards, that children end up being hurt.
Yeah.
So
They deal with the consequences of adults not making the right decisions.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And, it's hard enough if a child experiences that in their home, but when they experience that in their home and their school, and we wonder why some kids have a hard time with graduating or going on to become a responsible adult. If we look at the examples they've been given, I guarantee you that experience of the kids who got rotten food in school suspension and got sick from it, I think that probably definitely had a big impact on how they view teachers and schools and adults.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And even like their own value in a sense, because the adults are telling them like, this is what you deserve.
Right.
You don't even deserve, quality food. You get the rotten leftovers. Like
Exactly.
that's devastating.
Yes, yes, and I actually had multiple teachers and principals, under principals, who told me they knew what was happening, but they felt like their hands were tied because they needed to be able to feed their own children at home. So, it's a problem. There
Yeah.
was also same district. They,
This district had a lot going on. Oh my goodness.
I have 2 different districts, and they both had their own special challenges.
Yeah.
So, it's a mix of both, but there was one where, the administrator put everybody in inclusion, and then after we turned in the numbers to State Department, he called IEP meetings with every single child with special needs of some kind. I don't remember exactly what the diagnoses were, and basically bullied the parents into putting them in self-contained classrooms so that they wouldn't have to be tested with the state test, so their inclusion numbers would be high and their test scores would be high, which, I mean, if you
Wow.
think about it from an administrator's perspective, well, in some ways, yeah, that kinda makes sense for the district
On
because you
paper.
need good numbers. Yeah, and how are you supposed to get good numbers? So they're finding creative ways to get good numbers, but what does that do to kids?
But if they can be creative like that, it seems like they can be creative with figuring out how to help these kids.
Exactly,
I'll
exactly.
say the creativity is there.
That's right,
They
clearly, see,
find the
we've got an advantage.
flexibility.
Yeah, we've got an
Like,
advantage, they're very creative.
yeah, like just use it for good.
That's right, and, I mean, that's why I said that the most important thing an administrator does is set the level of ethics that we are going to adhere to for the people that work with them. I
Yeah.
think that's more important than anything, and it's frustrating because, when we talk about education, we're like, "Okay, give us the three-step plan. What are the practical things we can do to make a difference?" And
Yeah.
what I'm giving you is students need to learn about the humanities, and administrators and schools need to set a high standard of ethics. Neither of those can be legislated easily.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That's true.
No, it's the human component, though,
Yeah.
and that's what's important. You can create a system to do things, but that system isn't necessarily going to be able to solve all your problems. People will find a way around systems,
Okay.
and a system can't serve every single child
And it's the
because there's always limitations.
it's the students in special education who often end up
Yes.
underserved. Yeah.
Yes, yes, so often. Um, yeah, and honestly, we need to be focusing on those soft skills.
Mhm.
Too many times these days, kids are being made fun of in schools and being called autistic, whether they're autistic or not, because it's the latest popular
That's the
put down.
thing.
Yeah, it's a thing, and we need to be focusing on some of those soft skills so that we make friends with other people who are autistic, and we see that they have value to provide to this
Mhm.
world. They have value not because of what they and this is something that's really important to remember. We have value not because of what we do or what we're able to provide physically or mentally. We have value because we're human beings. And that was the mistake that was made in Nazi Germany. If you could not provide benefit to the state physically or mentally, you didn't have value. And we'd be the same thing today.
Very much so.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That's a sound clip right there. That's very relevant with the times sound clip.
It really is. It really
Yeah.
is. And honestly, I spend a good deal of my time. Yes, I work with a lot of families and students, but I do spend a good deal of my time advocating for students with a number of different kinds of disabilities because it's a real issue. I just had a author on my podcast the other day. She wrote a book about redefining Down syndrome. And she was talking about how, I think it was worldwide, 93% of pregnancies that test as being a Down syndrome pregnancy are terminated. 93% is a lot.
Yeah.
That's like at the eugenics type level.
Yeah.
So is it eugenics and we've like dressed it up to not look like eugenics? And honestly, like that's not necessarily a legislation thing.
Right.
That's a human thing, you know?
Right. And an
And
education thing.
yes. And
Yeah.
I went to an event for mothers just a weekend or two ago that all had a child with some kind of disability. And many of them had a Down syndrome child. And every single one of them who had gotten the diagnosis before they had the baby were repeatedly asked if they wanted to terminate over and over and over again. And it really angered them because they were like, what, do you think my child isn't worthwhile living? So
Yeah.
we have a lot of challenges with understanding that other people have values. We need to work on that.
Yeah. Yeah. And that is that education piece. You know, not education like K-12 education, but education as in like understanding these different diagnoses and what their life will look like with that.
That's the real work of education. It's not how quickly you can do your math facts or how well you can read or any of those other things. It's what kind of a human are you becoming?
Yeah.
That's the work of education. And, you know, in some ways, some of our legislation has made this more challenging. Like, you know, theoretically, the idea of testing kids to see where our progress is, that sounds like a good idea. And I mean, I test my kids every year in our homeschool. I do it because I gain valuable insights when I look at it and go, oh, we're having a little trouble here. We need to focus on that next year. But when we focus so much on testing, then that leaves the door open for us to try and alter our test scores. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a really big challenge and a really big problem because it's really not about those test scores. It's about being a better human.
Yeah. Yeah. This is really a full circle.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah. But we could talk all day because there is a lot. Like I might have to ask you to come back again so that we can talk about something else because you are just so knowledgeable and you speak with such passion. And I love that you have so many experiences to draw from. So
I'm very passionate about children being treated as being people of value.
Yeah. I love that. Well, thank you so much for being a guest. Again, I'm gonna try to get you back in a few months because this was awesome. I might see if our founder Vanessa can host that one. Have you met her?
I haven't yet.
Oh yeah, so she's the founder of Social Cipher and she's autistic also. But she is just like super knowledgeable as well, and yeah, I feel like that would be an awesome conversation.
Yeah, that sounds great.
I'm gonna talk to her about that.
All right.
But yeah, thank you so much again. Okay, I'm gonna stop it, but stay on so that it can finish.